Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's event, the 2024 Metro Mayor elections, the debrief or some early reflections. Today, I thought it'd be useful to run the event in two parts. So in a moment, as you can see, I'm joined by my colleague, Paul Swinney. So we're going to run through what actually happened, look at some of the numbers associated with the elections of last week. And then in the second part, we'll try to start to think about some of the implications and consequences of what happened for devolution as it is, but also devolution as it might be, particularly given the context of a general election at some point later on this year. So we'll try and do it in that. And in a moment, Paul will run through some slides, just providing some of the detail of what happened. And then as I say, we'll get into a bit of a discussion. We're really keen to hear from you, not just your questions for us, but also your own reflections, your own comments, your own queries based on last week. So use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to do that, if you will, both prompted by what Paul and I say, but also your own reflections, and we'll try and introduce those into the conversation as we go through. So to start us off, Paul, do you want to run through some of the facts and figures associated with what happened last week?
Fabulous. Thanks, Andrew. I shall do that. Right. So what have we learned over the weekend as the results have come in? Well, the first one, which I'm sure will be familiar to most people on the call, because this is where the main focus has been the results themselves. So we can see there from the map, 10 melodies out for election, and that map is pretty much all red, apart from the notable exception of Tees Valley, which we'll come on to in a second. So we've got the 10 mayors lined up there. A couple of new additions in terms of new mayoralties. So Kim McGuinness in the northeast and Claire Ward in the East Midlands for institutions that didn't exist before now have a mayor in place. And then one that really grabbed the headlines of the weekend, a change in mayor in the West Midlands, flipping from Andy Street, who was Conservative, over to Richard Parker, who is Labour. For all the other melodies, though, there wasn't any change. The incumbent was the person who won the election. What this look like in terms of vote shares, because obviously, you win or you don't win, that's a 1 or a 0. But looking at the vote shares becomes quite interesting to understand what went on within those different places. So first up to note is that in the Liverpool City region and in Greater Manchester, Steve Rotherham and Andy Burnham got more votes than all the other candidates combined, which is quite some going. So Steve Rotherham had the largest majority, 68% of the vote went towards him. In the Greater Manchester, it was 63% of the vote. Oliver Copper just sneaks in more votes than all other people, as does Tracy Braben too, but the biggest margins were in Liverpool City region and Greater Manchester. Next thing to note, I think, is in terms of the performance of the mayors relative to the national vote share. So we've picked out polling from the 29th of April, which says or predicts what people would vote in the general election. So for Labour, it would be 44% of people would vote Labour in the election. For Conservatives, 24%. To give some sort of baseline about how can we sort of measure some of these figures. As you can see there, for 4 of the Labour mayors, they got a higher share than what the national polling would predict, and the others sort of, it's lower, but it's not that much lower than what the national share says. But for the Conservatives, I think there are a couple of interesting counterexamples, particularly in Tees Valley and the West Midlands, where again a lot of the focus has been. So let's start off with West Midlands. You can see there towards the right-hand side, really, really tight race. So Richard Parker got 37.8% of the vote. Andy Street got 37.5% of the vote. Really the slimmest of margins in terms of what determined that. But I think what's quite interesting is yes, the Conservatives lost the West Midlands mayoralty, but actually Andy Street did pretty well relative to how the Conservatives are polling nationally. So 37.5 is much higher than the 24% that the party is polling nationally. And for Tees Valley, you can see that Ben Houchen did considerably better than what the National Party is doing. So 54% of the vote he polled relative to 24% nationally. I think this really speaks to the thing that we were highlighting in the run-up towards the election about mayoral elections being much more about place rather than politics, and candidates rather than politics. I think Houchen's vote in particular is testament to that. But also you can see that with Andy Street too, and that, you know, despite all the turmoil going on nationally, yes, he lost, but you know the vote share that he managed to pull in was much larger than what the National Party is doing, which suggesting that it is, you know, very much people more likely to vote for candidate than they are to vote for the Rosette. And just to highlight that to a greater extent, let's have a look at Hartlepool. So one of the local authorities that sits within the Tees Valley, it was the only local authority that had council elections last Thursday, as well as the mayoral elections. And you can really see this difference, you know, so you could say, well, Houchen's done well in Tees Valley, but actually everyone was voting Conservative. But if you look at the local authority votes or breakdown for councillors in Hartlepool, which is the left-hand side one there, you can see there that that 34% of people were voting Conservative in that election, and it was 51% the mayoral election. So of those people in Hartlepool who voted in the mayoral election, half of them were voting for Ben Houchen, but only a third of them voted for Conservative councillors for the local authority. Now, these things aren't directly comparable because you can see there that you've got different parties running, and certainly that reform vote could point to a switch of Conservative voters away from the Conservatives to reform, as we switch on to make sure the computer doesn't run out of battery. But still, I think it tells us something interesting about the background of, you know, what's going on politically. Big swing towards Labour in the Hartlepool elections, but actually, while Houchen did lose a degree of his vote compared to 2021, still very much the winner. Same thing happened in the Police and Crime Commissioner vote as well for the area. So the Labour won. Tories had it previously. There was a swing towards Labour, and Labour took that, but that didn't happen for the mayoralty, which is pointing something to how Ben Houchen is seen as a candidate and how he's projected himself in terms of going out to bat for the place, rather than just being sort of a Conservative candidate, and very much him not being able to find his Conservative rosette on a results day probably was something that was a good indication of that as well. Right, so of some of the new mayors, what are the types of things that they're talking about? How is this going to shift the agenda somewhat in terms of what mayors are focused on? So let's pick out three. So Claire Ward and Kim McGuinness, the two new ones. Of course, you've got York and North Yorkshire as well, where David Skaith is in too, but we'll focus on these two. And then Richard Parker as well, who has been the change in the West Midlands. Three areas where they're all talking about. You've got public transport, skills and employment, and business support. I think most interesting within this around public transport is that they're all saying that they're going to do bus franchising. So we have seen this start to happen in Greater Manchester already. It's being rolled out. It's about to happen in Liverpool City region and in South Yorkshire and West Yorkshire too. All three of the new mayors say that they're going to introduce that as well. And then in terms of skills and employment and business support, you've got a mix of different things. You know, the mayors focus on different specifics within that. But these are two things I think that were coming out quite strongly in terms of what they were talking about in the manifestos, and we should expect to hear more around that as well. Now, I think what was really interesting about the coverage in the last couple of days with the results was just how prominent the mayoral elections were. Now, traditionally, local elections are very much seen through the prism of them being referenda or national polling. You'll get individual authorities that get pulled out because there's something quite interesting going on. But in general, it's just, this is how many councillors Labour have gained, this is how many councillors Conservatives have gained or lost, and that's how it's reported. Whereas this time round, it felt like there was a difference in terms of the local election coverage. And the mayoralties very much took prominence in this, and there was a real national interest in terms of what was going on and pushing, those local elections up the agenda, but also sort of the focus on the individuals as well. This politician is important, which is very much something that doesn't come through in local authority elections, where there's very little focus on who's the new council leader going to be. This was much more about Andy Burnham has won. Andy Street has lost. Ben Houchen has retained his seat. And we'll pull out a couple of examples of that there. And certainly on the BBC's coverage throughout the weekend, it's rolling election coverage as it was changing its headlines. The headlines were Andy Burnham keeps Greater Manchester, or Ben Houchen retains West Midlands. Tees Valley, should I say, and Annie Street loses West Midlands. So I think that was an interesting and quite important moment for the devolution agenda, that the national press did take this seriously and was very much focused on the mayoral element of it, which was very welcome. So that's the good news. If we go to the less good news, turnout was down in most places. Now, we thought turnout would go up, because when we've looked at trends in the past, certainly, for the previous 2 elections outside of London, there was an increase in all of them. And even in London, there's a bit of volatility there of up and down, but in general, the trend was for the election for turnout to increase. But in pretty much every place apart from South Yorkshire, turnout was down. And this is a challenge, I think. So devolution is meant to be trying to engage voters more in the issues, is meant to be trying to show people why they should care, not go out and vote, because we've created, hopefully, mayors that have got some degree of power and incentivize people to go out and make it worth their while to walk round to the polling stations. But that didn't happen this time, or certainly to a lesser extent. So that's a challenge there in terms of that fall in turnout. And if you look at the level of turnout too, perhaps it's always going to happen when you've got local elections at the same time. But actual overall levels of turnout are pretty low too. I think we would want to see that turnout increase in the future. London gets around about 40% of people coming out to vote. Elsewhere, it's sort of ranging from late 20s through to early 30s, which is around about where local election turnout is anyway. So last year, 32.4% of people came out to vote in the local authority elections. The mayors are sort of oscillating around that, and would certainly hope, as we are creating and building these institutions, that turnout's going to increase and more people are going to engage in this and give the winning candidates a greater mandate for when they do win, by having that larger turnout as a result. I think the one bright spot, having said that, within all of this, is you can see there that the North East turnout actually was pretty high certainly for election for the first time over, and that's a positive. And it was the second highest turnout of any place. And that definitely is much higher probably than what we would have predicted, especially if you go back to that 2016-17 election result. You would have thought you would have thought the North East would have been somewhere within that range, perhaps towards the bottom, and it wasn't actually. It very much exceeded that. So that's one good element in terms of turnout. But I think that is the really big challenge that we face from this, and an interesting and slightly worrying outcome from the elections for us to no doubt have more of a chat about.
And thank you, Paul, for that. And we'll come back to different bits and pieces. We're going to have we'll ask you a question in a moment on turnout. But before we do that, because I think in a sense we were trying to highlight this issue about turnout, public engagement in the mayoral elections before the elections, and the role of the local media in drumming up interest and such. And actually, the session we did last week with some of the journalists from across the country were saying a little bit about that, about the fact that, there were kind of quite busy activities, but nevertheless, there's sort of underlying concerns about general awareness, which we also touched on in our polling as well. As probably to remind people of that, I think is quite important. But also, it's not just turnout, as you say, just for the turnout. It's actually about the accountability question, the legitimacy questions, the credibility questions that become associated with that, because that's part of the argument for the Metro mayors, right? They are directly elected by their citizens, and therefore that in itself gives them a big mandate and a bit of political influence.
Yeah, definitely. I think you do want to see that larger vote shares, larger turnout to give that greater mandate. Now, having said that, some of the figures we're talking about in terms of the number of people who voted in absolute terms are very, very large. So in the West Midlands, I think Richard Parker was something like 230,000, if I remember off the top of my head, which still makes him one of the politicians in the UK has the largest, well, one of the largest mandates of anywhere. But we would want that to be, 500,000 plus, I think, for the winning candidate in the West Midlands, rather than where it is currently. So I think there's work to be done from the mayors still to be over the next term, to be talking about and showing why the institution is very, very important, and why the voters should care about that. And hopefully, if we do see this continuation of devolution from whoever's in power the national government in the next parliamentary period, that by empowering those institutions further, hopefully will incentivise people more to engage in the mayoral elections and go out and vote in them as well.
Yeah. So let's stick on turnout for a second, because we've had a question in already, and you said you were literally about to go to turnout, and you said it might be jumping the gun. So you were thinking ahead of us, but just asking a question about turnout. What does that mean for the model? We've got a couple of poll questions. So let's have poll question 1 up on the screen if we can, please. So it's interesting in your reflections now. So why do you think turnout was lower than previous Metro Mayor elections? Say the general trend was that election on election, they tend to go up, maybe not always by lots, but they tend to increase. This wasn't the case this time round. We've given you kind of 3 specific options you can read yourself: local awareness of the elections, powers available to the mayors, i.e. they're not very powerful, so why should I bother? And then a kind of general distrust in local politicians. We picked up some of these issues in our polling as well, so get your reflection on that in a moment, Paul, in addition. And then we've got other. So if you think it's one of the 3, then great. If you think it's others, click other, and it'd be lovely to hear from you in the Q&A as to what your other reason is. So I've been waffling on. So if you can vote now, and then we'll just have the results up. So we've got distrust in local politicians, so is a sort of general reason. So it doesn't matter who you are. If you're a politician, the public doesn't like you. Then that's followed by other. So say if you've got other, it'd be great to see if you can type into Q&A what your other is. That would be lovely. And then obviously lower awareness. So didn't really know what was going on. So we'll come to the other in a minute, Paul. But what were the kind of responses, if you remember, from the polling that we did as to why people were or weren't likely to vote?
So lack of awareness was the big one in most places. I think the people just didn't really know that the election was happening. Now, we were running this polling 6 weeks out, I think, from when the election happened, and hopefully some of the push for raising awareness has helped with that. And certainly the North East result in particular would suggest that, because knowledge of the election in the North East was really, really low in the polling, and yet actually turnout was, as I said, was relatively good. So hopefully that's made some difference there. But clearly, if we're still having 2/3 of people not voting in the election, it seems as if lack of knowledge is part of it, given actually those figures and also what we saw from the polling that we did. Distrust of politicians was another one as well that came through. I think interestingly, in those areas that had higher awareness, so Greater London and Greater Manchester in particular, distrust played a larger role. So people were aware that election was going on, but actually then gave greater weight to distrust of politicians. So I think again it probably points to the mayors having to put more work in, even more work in, to show sort of what they do, why they should be trusted, and again the element of sort of place over politics to try and build that trust locally. And I think that the mayoral positions offer the opportunity to do that sort of thing and sort of separate this political figure or this political position away from perhaps some of the shenanigans that we've seen at the national level in recent years, to build trust in the institution.
Yeah, and obviously it's all very complicated, etc., etc. But the sort of the general distrust of politicians, apathy with where we are, political cycle, etc., particularly the mainstream parties. You can see that pretty much every day being covered extensively by the media in different ways. But it also then interacts with our place over politics kind of finding, in that when we did the polling beforehand, people were marginally more likely to vote for the person rather than the party, the candidate, rather than necessarily the party they represent. And you could see a little bit of that in the vote share, where some of the, they're definitely outperforming what you would expect. So there's a kind of interesting dynamic between, curse on all local politicians, but also if I'm going to vote, I may vote for individuals as well, rather than not.
Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting, I think. And so people have been putting some comments in the chat. Just because I am technologically constrained, if you could try to put your points in in the Q&A, just so I can keep an eye on that bit more. But I think several of the others are essentially lack of interest in politics, disaffection with both main parties, widespread apathy, and all the rest of it. So sort of a similar set of themes around why we think people didn't vote. On the policy manifesto front, you touched on that just through the slides, Paul. Quite interesting that that public transport, particularly buses, which we know obviously the Labour Party have come out in favour of franchising and say that they would offer that to all places as part of their manifesto, and if they got into government. And some of the mayors, as you've said, East Midlands, West Midlands, whereas the previous mayor was always more reluctant on the franchising front, down in favour of that. As you say, even the Yorks and North York mayor is in favour of franchising, although he hasn't explicitly said that he would go down that route. So it's a kind of interesting one that has particularly become a real issue for several of them. The challenge always is getting it actually done, which we're always reminded, franchising is a good thing, but you need to think about how you fund it and finance it over the longer term.
Yes, yeah, definitely. I think we're big fans of bus franchising here, so I think that there are even more mayors talking about it. I think in principle is a very good thing, notwithstanding the question about how you do fund that. And this isn't just, oh, we're going to do it and it's great, we've got control of the buses. There is a funding question about we're basically providing a bigger subsidy for the bus network, and how is that going to be sustainably funded? Is that just through grant from central government, or is that actually through having to raise some of this locally through congestion charges or workplace parking levies or the other levers that the mayors could pull? Are they actually willing to put their skin in the game and do some of that? But certainly I think bus franchising now is being seen as, I think it's twofold actually. I think there's one, this came out from the polling, that transport is very much more recognisable as a policy in terms of what the mayors do. So people are much more likely to be able to identify a transport policy. So I think there's sort of a small p political game there from the mayors to, well, I've got to have a transport policy, and I've got to have something that I can do and shout about, because that's the thing that seems to sort of insert itself in the public consciousness more than other policy areas.
Yeah.
But then bus franchising seems to become the thing now that a lot of mayors want to use to do that, which I think is a good thing. But clearly they need to understand sort of the implications of doing that and the time it will take to do that as well. It took 7 years in Greater Manchester to get franchising through. It could well be that the mayors who are talking about bringing in franchising now, of the new ones, that there might not be something they actually deliver within their current term. We'll watch this space to see how that plays out.
Yeah, and then the other two areas which you highlighted, again, almost universal, understandably, universal commentary and pledges or commitments to do stuff around skills. And particularly within that, you had things like careers services and careers advice, but he also had, the good employment charters, which again have been introduced in Greater Manchester and other places previously, sort of also being prominent in and around that space. So very, unsurprisingly, given they've got some powers and resources in that area, skills and employment being one of those areas as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think mayors have got relatively limited levers to pull. This is something we'd like to see change. If we are going to make them akin to the mayors that you get on the continent or in the US, they should have a much larger number of tools in their toolbox to use. I think probably that then means is that when it comes to the types of things that they're seeing, because they're relatively constrained, they are going to be talking about similar areas. So transport is one, but skills and employment and business support is another. And I think it's quite interesting in terms of some of the variation that you get. So Kim McGuinness in the Northeast, very much her one of her leading mantras has been around, or focuses has been around, poverty reduction.
Yes.
And so that she's proposing sort of Sure Start Plus models. Bit jargon, I'm sure that's based on the Sure Start model that New Labour had put in place, and interesting work by IFS recently about the success of that. More of her focus is into that area, whereas the other mayors will have slightly different focuses in terms of their approach. And there's still that degree of flexibility about how they use those limited powers to focus on different things. But I think what will be interesting to see will be not only how do the mayors individually, but also as a bloc, develop or use the policies that they have in place, but how are they going to speak as one voice about the types of powers that they need to extract from Westminster and have them passed down? What's going to happen next to Trailblazer deals, for example? What's going to happen around fiscal devolution? Are this cohort of mayors going to talk about this sort of thing or not? We'll wait and see.
Yeah, no, very good. Question in this sort of vein from James Stevens. Hello, James. You ask a question about, is spatial planning still too divisive politically? Might we expect to get a push if there is a Labour government? Would the Metro mayors support? Good set of questions. So I think you didn't see much conversation, or at least I didn't see much conversation about planning per se, although obviously I think it did come up a little bit in London. But what you did see in several of the conversations, and particularly in the manifestos of those that produce it, was quite a big focus around questions about housing. And, understandably, there's questions about the quality of housing, whether it's, new build or in the rented sector or in the social sector. But also then there's obviously questions about affordability, the ability to be able to rent and or to buy. All of those came up, and it's quite interesting. I think they came up in many places. So that in itself has a planning consequence and implication. So I would say that, get your thoughts on that, Paul. My other point, which is again an obvious one, it's been quite clear from the Labour Party at the moment that they see a prominent role for planning reform in unlocking some of the growth, or a lot of the growth, that they are aspiring to get, whether you think about either on a housing front, we've heard a lot about that, grey belt, etc., but also in forms of green technology in renewables, particularly unlocking the planning system to new developments. We also know that if they are going to do that, then they're going to have to take on some local authorities who are, let's say, less reluctant to permit development, and they span both Labour and the Conservatives. So there'll be an interesting sort of dynamic around Labour Party aspirations for growth. They need planning reform to do that. How do they then deal with places that may be more reluctant or unwilling to allow development? And that they just won't be Conservative authorities. They'll also be Labour authorities as well. So it's an interesting dynamic going on, I think.
So spatial planning is in principle the most powerful tool that a mayor can have in their toolbox. So
if they've got them,
exactly.
Yeah.
So mayors have been created to do economic strategy over the area that people live and work their lives over. So it's not just powers in one local authority where, let's say, let's pick out Newcastle, for example. Clearly, the northeast economy stretches beyond Newcastle. You want to have a politician or policy making that sort of reflects that broader geography. And spatial planning is a very key one, where you want to be thinking about where the jobs, where the housing, how's the transport link into that, and it very much covering that travel to work area. But very few places have them. So Greater Manchester in principle has this power. Greater London has this power. I think there's one other mayoralty that might have it. I can't remember off the top of my head, but most of the mayoralties don't have these spatial planning powers. If that's going to change, that will have to be the national government passing those powers down to the mayoralty rather than the mayors going out to ask. And the reason for that is because the small p politics of this are just too difficult. Now, this was particularly an issue within West Midlands. So when Andy Street was mayor, he would always say externally that he didn't want to have spatial planning powers and he didn't need to have them. I think part of the reason why he probably did that is because he knew that if he did go out and say that, all the local authorities would have a massive bun fight with them over it, because they want to keep control of planning. And indeed, that's why spatial planning didn't go into the original devolution deal, because when the local authority leaders negotiated it with national government, they wanted to retain control of planning. Now, the real challenge we've got in terms of the structure of mayoralties is that, unlike in London, elsewhere in the combined authority model, the mayor is only one amongst equals. So basically, he or she really has to keep the local authority leaders on side, rather than sort of unilaterally saying, well, I'm just going to do this and I'm just going to do that. And that's why then, even in Greater Manchester, one of the few places that does have, in principle, spatial planning powers, Andy Burnham actually can't use them. Because what happened, we saw a couple of years ago, was that they tried to put a spatial plan forward, Stockport at the 11th hour disagreed with it, and the whole thing fell apart. And now the plan they've brought forward is being very much led by the local authorities rather than the mayor. So you've got an element of two things here. Either the mayor doesn't have those powers and can't ask for them because of the local politics, and so they have to be passed down by national government. And then the second element is that even in places that do have them, the mayor can have it in his or her toolbox, but the ability to use it actually is constrained by the current structure of the way that that the mayoral is set up. So it's not clear about what we will see around spatial planning in the future, despite, like I say, in principle, being the most powerful tool that they can have. And I think we need to see some changes around that.
Yeah. Okay, great. So let's do sort of part two, because we've had a few questions in, which is really about looking forward, as much as, reflections on what's just happened. So we now have our 12 mayors. Obviously, the two that weren't up for election this time will be next year. So we've got was the M10, now it's the M12. So there's a kind of question around that. As you said earlier on, Paul, 50% of England is now covered by a mayor and combined authority. So we're at that kind of moment. Both parties, at least before last Thursday, were very much in favour of devolution. Both had expressed a commitment to carry on the agenda. Both of them very much focused on filling in the gaps, so the 50% that don't have, as well as obviously thinking about the 50% that do have and giving them more powers as well. So that's where we were. Obviously, remember going back to the day, the origins of the mayoral idea by Osborne, particularly when he was mayor, because he saw the political opportunities to actually have more conservative mayors, maybe in parts of the country that were traditionally regarded as being Labour. And now we've just seen a swing where we've only got one conservative mayor. So there's a kind of bunch of questions and issues, all of which will be played out over time around the future of devolution in the general sense as well as in the specific. So we've got a second poll question, which we'll give some reflection on what we think the answer to this question is. But before we do, let's get our second poll question up, which is about the current situation and whether you think so. Thinking about now what we have in terms of the 12 mayors, so 11 being Labour and 1 being Conservative. Do you think that these are results? So that's the situation where we are. Do you think they help or hinder devolution in the future? Help or hinder? So you may well have more of a nuanced response, which is somewhere in between. It all depends. We get that, but just for now, let's just get a general quick reflection from our audience as to whether they think this situation helps or hinders. Right, let's get the results. So overwhelmingly positive, I like that. It's a sunny day, and we're what more? Just had a long bank holiday weekend, so people are in a good, optimistic mood. So 83% say they think it will help, and 17%, small number, say it will hinder. Again, feel free to use the Q&A function, please, rather than the chat function, if you want to explain why you're optimistic or while you're not. I get Paul's reaction on it now. The obvious point to say is heavily skewed towards Labour. The obvious concern would be that the cross-party consensus on the mayors is in danger of breaking down if the Conservatives think that they aren't going to win any, and they've only got one. Does that mean that they're less in favour of it than they would have been if they'd had more? We don't know. We will see, obviously, as we move towards the general elections, to what that might be. My other thought is, just watching and listening to the existing mayors, but also some of the new ones, I think their expectations of a Labour government are already high and are likely to go higher in terms of what they think they're going to get from a Labour government, both in terms of resources and in terms of powers. Their expectations may be met, they may not, and if they're not, what will they then do, particularly as many of them have expressed their ambition and their intention to put place before politics. Where does that leave us? We don't know, obviously, but it's just an interesting set of reflections. Paul, 83% said they think this helps. What do you think?
Interesting that it was so high, actually. I like the optimism. So I think there's a few reflections around this. So go to your point, Andrew, about Labour mayors and potential Labour government. It was very interesting, I think, what two of the mayors said in their acceptance speeches. So Andy Burnham very much stressed about, I'm continuing to be a mayor, place first, politics second, which seemed to be a suggestion that you'll hold any government's feet to the fire, which is exactly what the mayoral position should be doing. Very much this theme of place over politics coming out. Again, reflecting, I think, the branding he used in his election campaign, where actually Labour wasn't featured. He used the colour red, but it didn't say the Labour Party. It was about Andy Burnham, the individual, which we saw from Ben Houchen as well, who also made some interesting comments too, where he'd said something along the lines of, he will work with the next government, whatever the colour will be. Now, I think it's fair to say that Ben has probably been the most partisan of any of the mayors in recent years, and very much sort of, having the popular Labour mayors and backing Conservative policies. This was a change in sort of his rhetoric, seemingly, now having to make overtures to the Labour Party and expectations, seeming that he thinks, obviously I'm putting words in his mouth here, that there will be a change in government. So it'd be interesting to see how he acts now within that setup. Whereas in the past, he's very much been, Conservative mayor, Conservative government. I've got a hotline into Boris Johnson, a hotline into Rishi Sunak, and I get things into my area. And we've seen that through the Freeport, through the Darlington Economic Campus, which we went to visit last week as well. How will he operate with a Labour government? All eyes on that. I think there's something interesting in terms of the change in the makeup of some of the mayors that we've got in place, and whether, irrespective of party, whether they become or continue to be good adverts for devolution. So first thing to say is that we will always get variation in this across all the mayors. You'll have some mayors which are very effective at being a mayor, and you'll have some that will be less effective. We're never going to get, all the now 12 mayors being absolutely fantastic. I won't pick out the ones that we don't think work so well. I'll leave you to guess on that one. I think what will be interesting within this will be, so what's the change that we've seen here? Well, in the northeast, we've gone from just the north of Tyne to expanded northeast combined Mayoral combined authority. Jamie Driscoll, who came second in this election, was the mayor of north of Tyne. And I think it's fair to say that that Jamie probably didn't project himself as much as, say, an Andy Burnham or particularly a Ben Houchen did, just south of his constituency. I think the hope there will be that Kim McGuinness will be able to do a better job of that, to be able to have this figurehead that represents the Northeast and speaks both nationally and internationally, as well as speaking locally. I think that will be required if we are going to see, the furthering of the devolution agenda in that part of the world, or greater contribution from that part of the world. The other interesting element of this is the loss of Andy Street. Now, again, putting politics to one side, Andy Street was very much
pragmatist.
A pragmatist, but also he was somebody you could point to say he does being a mayor very well. And so for people who are campaigning for, devolution, its merits and why we should have greater devolution, Andy Street, amongst others, was one that you could point to say, look, this is what it should look like. I think the challenge now certainly there's, big shoes to fill. It'll be really interesting, I think, to see how Richard Parker fills that, and hopefully will do, so we can continue to make the case as to why devolution is an important thing, and why the national government, whatever colour that should be, should continue to back the mayors with ever more powers.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. And I think, it's an obvious statement given that where we are with the, the centralized nature of the country, notwithstanding, the issues we're talking about today, for the mayors individually and collectively to be successful, they will have to have a supportive national government, not just on a transactional basis, which obviously some benefit very directly from that, but a very supportive government that is essentially looking at ways to engage with them, to draw them into the conversation, but also to see them as being important institutions within the political arrangements that we have, and also as critical institutions for delivering things on the ground that make a material difference to people's lives. You do have to have a supportive government in order to do that, and that's a question that we've seen play out, but it'll play out in a general election as well. All of the mayors will struggle if the national government, whoever it might be, is not as enamored or is not as supportive of mayors as maybe have in the past. So it's just something to to think about in that respect. And just that it's an obvious thing again, but you talked about variation within the sample of 12. What I think illustrates that, it comes on to a second question we've had from we've had lots of questions, but from Kevin about how the mayor should work together. Even within a sample of 12, we've now got this is the 7th mayor of London, as it were, or the 7th term, right? We've had three people do the job, but this is essentially the 7th time that a mayor of London has been elected. And yet, on the other hand, we have East Midlands and others that, this is the first time. Greater Manchester, this is the 3rd time. Liverpool City Region, this is the 3rd time, etc. So even within that, there's a fair bit of variation. And I think that does raise questions about the ability, the appetite, the efficiency of the mayors working together in some kind of confederation, some kind of coalition, some kind of conference, whatever you want to call it, as a group, in order to make arguments to national government. And that's not just a political point, 11 Labour, 1 Conservative, but actually the variation in institutional capacity and capability may actually prevent them coming together as a group of 12 on things that are more detailed and more variated. But again, we don't know on that, right? That's the kind of question. Yeah. So that is partly the question about, from Kevin, about do we see them working together? And then there was another question from somebody who's anonymous, but nevertheless asking a question about, if Metro mayors are to be successful and more well-known, future devolution has to get serious about fiscal devolution. Yes, it does. And allowing more divergence in local taxation. Yes, it does. Do we think that the current crop of mayors are going to do that? And will they work together? So there's a question about A, the issue, but B, the mayors working together. And again, it's interesting. We'll see. What we do know is that, announcements or statements thus far from the Labour Party said they're not particularly in favour of, or they're not in favour at all of fiscal devolution as part of their devolution settlement, whatever that might be, if and when they get into power. So again, it's a kind of interesting set of issues, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, how will they organise themselves? So there is the was the M10, wasn't it? If mayors coming together to talk through these issues, will they push for that to be more formal? Will the next government push for that to be more formal? And I think even within that, going back to what I was saying earlier, how will Ben Houchin sort of act within that group as well? Because I think previously he sort of seen himself as, I am my own man, and I'm not going to go and play with all these Labour mayors. I'm not going to go and talk directly to the Conservative government. If it is then a Labour government, will we see him be more collaborative in that sense and contributing to the debate about what mayors in general should have, and then what powers should be passed down, rather than him sort of very much just focused on the Tees Valley? So the number of interesting dynamics that are going on there, and we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, brilliant. I think we'll draw it to a close. I think that's been really helpful. I mean, hopefully you got a sense, as we wanted to deliberately talk a little bit about what actually happened and give you some, some of the numbers, some of the facts behind what was happening over the weekend, particularly. But I think as much as what's happened, it then raises a set of questions or a set of issues about the future of devolution, not only in those places themselves, but as a movement more generally, and as a collective force for bringing about change, particularly in England, and what implications that might have for Scotland and for Wales in due course. There's a bunch of interesting questions. Obviously, all of that more pertinent because we're in the context of a looming general election where many of these issues will play out in different ways. You can see that, talking about on the Conservative side, using the mayors as symbols and illustrations of what should really be done, but also the Labour mayors showing what a potentially Labour government would do and what the issues that they would focus on. So there's lots to discuss lots to think about. As always, thank you very much for joining. You can get the slides. They'll be available very shortly, if not already, on our website, along with all the work that we've been doing in the run-up and through the elections as well. Podcasts, briefings, events, etc. You can get them all on our website, centreforcities.org. But until the next time, take care and stay safe. Thanks very much.